Hello, everybody. A few years ago now, I covered two Royal Navy fleet exercises from 1929, and given that that seemed to be quite popular as a comparison to the US Navy fleet problems videos, I thought, why not continue that? So, we're going to do that today, and we're going to start off by looking at exercise M1, which immediately succeeded the previous two exercises, taking place on the 23rd of March 1929. For reference, the two exercises we looked at before, MA and MZ, took place in the middle of January 1929 for MA, and just a week earlier, on the 18th of March 1929, for MZ. Like MZ, M1 used elements of both the Mediterranean and Atlantic fleets, so it was quite a large exercise. And this exercise was quite interesting from two perspectives. Firstly, it pitted two entire battle fleets against each other. So essentially the Royal Navy was looking at what if we fought a Jutland-style engagement again. But secondly, it was also looking at aircraft carrier operation, and particularly aircraft carrier operation en masse, at least as far as you could get en masse in the 1920s. So the objectives are listed as 1, to provide opportunities for the combined fleets to be handled under conditions approximating those of a fleet action, and 2, to investigate the coordination required when several aircraft carriers are working together, the aircraft being operated in accordance with their duties in action as laid down in the battle instructions and manoeuvring orders. In order to keep the exercise area a little bit smaller than an entire ocean, there were speed limits imposed, but they were proportional to the ship types. So battleships and battleship stand-ins, which we'll see in a minute, were limited to 16 knots. Battle cruisers, and any ship pretending to be one, could go to 22 knots, as could cruisers. Destroyers were allowed 24 knots, and the aircraft carriers were limited to varying speeds. Furious and Courageous were limited to 22 knots, Eagle was down to 17, and Argus to 16. So spoiler alert for some of the aircraft carriers involved, but obviously none of these are their top speeds, but the reductions are roughly proportional. So their relative speed advantages versus each other remain approximately the same. In one corner, we have the Red Fleet, operating under the command of Sir Frederick Field, who at this point in his career was the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. He'd initially seen action in the Boxer Rebellion, he'd commanded the World War I era HMS King George V at the Battle of Jutland, and he would go on to be First Sea Lord in the early 1930s. And his fleet consisted of the battleships Queen Elizabeth, Barham, Royal Oak, Royal Sovereign, Resolution, Ramillies, Revenge, Nelson, Rodney, Benbow, and Benbow was standing in for both her and Emperor of India, and the battleship Marlborough, which gave him a notional strength of 12 battleships, although obviously he only physically had 11. He also had the battle cruiser Renown, 7 cruisers in the form of the Frobisher, Danae, Cardiff, Ceres, Calliope, Caledon, and Cairo. He had the services of 5 destroyer flotillas, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th, and the aircraft carrier Argus, which had 2 destroyers of its own as escorts. Argus, incidentally, was carrying a flight of Fairey Flycatcher fighters, a flight of the notorious Blackburn, and a flight of Fairey 3D floatplanes. And in the other corner we have the Blue Team under Rear Admiral Frederick Charles Dreyer, yep, the one that invented the Dreyer fire control table and had also been at Jutland as Jellicoe's flag captain. And he was flying his flag aboard the battlecruiser HMS Hood, which was appropriate because at this point in time he was the Rear Admiral commanding battlecruiser squadron, and his force consisted of the battlecruisers Hood, Repulse, and the cruiser Adventure, but these were all, for the purposes of this exercise, cosplaying as a division of 4 battleships apiece, so he also had 12 battleships notionally. The cruiser HMS Centaur was standing in for a Renown-class battlecruiser, And then you had the cruisers Vindictive, Comus, Cambrian, Canterbury, and Douglas. Now, although listed as a cruiser, Vindictive, of course, could still operate aircraft at this point because she'd spent some time as an aircraft carrier in the early 1920s. He also had 3 destroyers, the Broke, Volunteer, and Vansittart. I don't know where they came up with that name, but anyway, each of those standing in for a whole destroyer flotilla, so he only had 3/5 the destroyer strength of the opposite team, and a little bit less in terms of cruisers. And of course, the sharp-eyed amongst you would have noticed that Douglas, listed as a cruiser, isn't actually a cruiser. She's a destroyer flotilla leader, but she's standing in this case. But although the blue team is a little bit short on destroyers and cruisers compared to the red team, it does have a preponderance of aircraft carriers. Not only does it have the Vindictive operating a handful of aircraft, but whereas the red team only has Argus, blue team has Courageous, Eagle, and Furious, each of which have 2 destroyers running escort on them. And the air complement given for those is as follows. Vindictive is carrying half a flight of Fairy 3D search and reconnaissance aircraft. Courageous, Furious, and Eagle are all carrying Dart torpedo aircraft, 2 flights on Courageous and Furious, 1 flight on Eagle. Courageous also carries 2 flights of Fairy 3F search and recon aircraft. Furious has a flight of Blackburns and a flight of 3Fs, and Eagle has a flight of Bisons. And then in fighters, everybody is carrying Fairy Flycatchers, a total of 4 flights, 2 on Courageous, 1 on Furious, 1 on Eagle. Command of blue team's carriers devolved to the commanding officer of HMS Courageous, and the general notes in establishment of the exercise state that the idea is that red and blue are at war, the fleets of both powers are at sea and are both anxious to fight, with the opposing fleets being of approximately equal strength, obviously discounting the disparity of carriers. The exercise will commence at 1400, at which time the opposing battle fleets are to be within 10 miles of prearranged positions and steering courses towards one another, which are within 20 degrees of the line joining the appropriate initial positions. Aircraft recon may commence at noon, but the air striking force cannot attack before 1400. Gun and torpedo fire will be represented in the normal manner, and dummy torpedoes may be fired by blue torpedo aircraft and will be picked up by destroyers detailed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. Torpedoes will then be returned to the aircraft carriers at Gibraltar AM on Tuesday the 26th of March. There's also some rather interesting additional notes to the carriers. Due to the lack of submarines in this exercise, they wouldn't be required to carry out anti-submarine patrols, but very interestingly, compared to the US Navy fleet exercises where they're operating their carriers independently, it's specifically noted, and bearing in mind we're still talking 1929, that torpedo bomber aircraft from Courageous, Eagle, and Furious would be operated as a single overall torpedo bomber formation made up of all 5 flights, while Vindictive was ordered not to fly off her aircraft unless specifically ordered to, essentially being kept in reserve and used primarily as a cruiser. Admiral Dreyer listed his intentions as to the use of aircraft carriers as follows, with a total of 8 points. 1. To employ air reconnaissance during the approach and action observation and lookout aircraft when contact is made. 2. To attack the enemy battle fleet with torpedo bomber aircraft escorted by fighters as soon as the fleets become engaged. This is to be known as Striking Force 1. 3. To attack enemy destroyers with fighter aircraft as soon as they commence moving out to attack our vanguard. This will be Striking Force 2. 4. To attack the enemy aircraft carriers with fast search and recon or strike and recon aircraft as soon as located. This force will be known as Striking Force 3. 5. To establish anti-aircraft patrols of fighters and Fairy 3F aircraft over our own fleet and aircraft carriers. 6. To employ aircraft to warn our carriers of the approach of any enemy surface vessels that might endanger them. 7. To employ aircraft spotting for our 3 battle fleet divisions on the basis of 2 aircraft for each division and 1 aircraft for the battle cruiser. And 8. To have smoke-making aircraft available at any time after contact is made, either to screen our own battle fleet or temporarily to isolate a part of the enemy forces. Now, the reason I chose this exercise in particular for this video is that there isn't actually any real analysis of the, if you like, fleet battle element of the exercise. The Royal Navy seems to have thought that, at least for this action, that was relatively unimportant to include. Instead, they include an incredibly extensive write-up of the air action part of things, which, the Royal Navy sometimes being accused of being a little bit backwards, shows just how important they were considering aircraft carriers even in the late 1920s. So, since we're not going to be doing a blow-by-blow of the actual exercises fleet battle, let's go through all the various comments and recommendations and observations from the air action. The commanding officer of HMS Courageous wrote in the report that the similarity in question of torpedo bombers attacking by flights separately or in a massed formation is actually very similar to the problem of whether destroyers should attack individually or in small formations or as entire flotillas. But his judgment is that overall a massed attack is the better policy as long as sufficient control can be attained. But he also notes that the difficulty of flights from different carriers working together, both in forming up and in carrying out the attack, was seen. It suggested that if massed attacks are to be the policy of torpedo bomber aircraft, carriers should work together more often. As in this exercise, 5 flights took 35 minutes to form up, and even then the rear 2 was still astern of station at the moment they actually attacked. Now, on the day of the exercise, the winds were fairly light, and in a direction that wasn't all that conducive to the direction Blue Fleet was generally going. And so Courageous's commanding officer raises the 4 points as follows with regards to the loss of position of the carrier relative to the fleet. First point, whether all carriers should lose position in order to keep in touch with the senior officer of aircraft carriers, as laid out in the battle instructions, needs assessing. In this exercise, Courageous, which of course was the lead ship, was at between 3 and 5:45 forced 25 miles to the eastward, while the fleet was steaming southwest. Furious and Eagle, operating fewer aircraft, did not lose so much ground. For reference, 10 minutes in wind represented 7.7 miles lost ground. So essentially what he's saying here is that with the wind forcing Courageous to sail east, as opposed to the rest of the fleet going southwest, according to the battle instructions, the other carriers should try and keep in contact with the senior carrier, but of course that meant that all the carriers were being separated quite quickly from the main battle fleet, even though with a smaller air group aboard them, Furious and Eagle could technically have turned back to try and catch up with the main battle fleet much earlier than Courageous did. 2. The importance of keeping the speed over the deck as low as is consistent with safety and the necessity of continual deck landing practice to reach efficiency in this respect is noted. So essentially what he's saying here is that if the carriers are forced to split from the main fleet, then as long as they are safely operating aircraft, they should try and do so at as low a speed as is possible to operate those aircraft in order to minimize the separation from the fleet. 3. Whether returning aircraft need necessarily land on their own carrier, and if an organization could be arranged whereby they land on the leeward carrier. It is realized that this suggestion is open to considerable objection owing to congestion in the smaller carriers. So, for this point, he's pointing out that, well, if you operate a mass strike of aircraft from lots of different ships, when they come back, they may find a different carrier to their home carrier, and then is it worth the congestion of people going backwards and forwards across each other's flight paths just to land back on their own carrier? If everyone's operating together anyway, why not have everybody land on either the first carrier they come across, or as he suggests, the leeward carrier, i.e. the one which is downwind of the others, because this would allow the ones that further upwind to continue operating aircraft while the one that's downwind collects aircraft, but acknowledging that, of course, Courageous might be able to do that, but something like Argus would quickly get overwhelmed if everybody's torpedo bombers started trying to land on her. And then finally, point 4, to what extent it is permissible to lose position for flying. It is suggested that in peace exercises, carriers should be allowed to use their full speed in order to remain within visibility distance of the fleet, thus lessening the risk of returning aircraft losing the carrier. In wartime, a large proportion of aircraft flown off will be shot down and not returned to the carrier. So essentially what he's saying is, in peacetime, allow the carriers to use their full speed while in exercises everybody else is restricted, because then the carriers can keep station better with the rest of the fleet, which means we won't lose aircraft pointlessly because they go off trying to find a carrier that's gone off over the horizon or been left behind. And in wartime, because he's anticipating losses, it's probably not going to be quite so much of an issue because you're going to have fewer aircraft to recover. Now, remember, another point was to how to protect the carriers. Well, Courageous's commander officer writes, as regards attack by surface vessels, early and continuous information of their movements is the surest defense. As regards air attack, there is only one sure method, and that is to bomb the enemy carrier as soon as possible. So, paralleling US experience. Each exercise carried out so far has proved the difficulty of an air patrol over our own ships sighting enemy aircraft in time to intercept them before their attack. That kind of observation would lean very heavily into the design of modern carriers in the mid-1930s for the Royal Navy. There's also quite considerable notes on the efficacy of radio communication, noting that the Atlantic Fleet procedure for action observation and lookout aircraft appeared to be very effective, but also, despite the fact that signals were passed with a minimum of delay and interference, there's a recommendation for more powerful radios, as signals from more distant aircraft, already in touch with the enemy, weren't heard for a considerable period of time due to the aircraft having to basically come back towards the fleet to give their reports, and specifically noting the difference in strength in signals from the Bison fleet spotters and the Fairey 3F recon aircraft was quite noticeable, with the Bisons having much better radio strength, and therefore obviously better radios, stronger radios, more transmissions will come through more clearly and can be done from further away. Eagle's commanding officer writes not as extensively as Courageous's, but has some very interesting observations with regards to peace versus war exercises. So I'm going to quote his notes verbatim. Eagle experienced no difficulty in flying off aircraft as ordered by Commanding Officer HMS Courageous, but it should be remembered that this exercise was of the nature of a set piece, and that precise instructions as to the duties of each flight had been received from Commander-in-Chief Blue before leaving harbour, and that no reliefs for aircraft had to be provided. With this accurate information available, it was possible to arrange the flying program in advance, with the result that there was no congestion on the flying deck. In war, when the movements of the enemy and the times at which he will make them are entirely uncertain, it is probable that considerable difficulty would be experienced in carrying out the orders of senior officer aircraft carriers, and that the delay in doing so must be expected. Also, with reference to Battle Instructions 184 Part B, it is not known whether divisional commanders notified the senior officer aircraft carriers at what time spotting aircraft would be required, but no orders were received in Eagle, and so spotting aircraft were flown off so as to be ready for spotting at the estimated time of deployment. In war, it's doubtful if the time of deployment could be estimated with accuracy by the carrier, with the result that, if deployment is considerably delayed beyond that time, the spotting aircraft would be running short of fuel by the time the gun action opened. The emphasis on the importance of divisional commanders complying with the above-quoted clause of battle instructions, i.e. what he was saying is, the fleet, as they closed in, hadn't actually told the carriers when they were going to be in sight of the enemy, and so, because it was an exercise, they could have the spotting aircraft roughly ready in time, but in time of war, when you might come into contact with the enemy at any point during the day, more communication from the capital ships was needed so that they could have spotters ready to go. Furious's commanding officer, in the meantime, wrote far more extensively on the actual torpedo bomber attack, noting that several flights were combined in a V disposition, with the leading flight tasked to make an initial attack on the enemy's two leading ships, and then the remaining flights to attack in quick succession as soon as the enemy had committed to a turn. So although it was a mass strike, they weren't all going in to drop torpedoes simultaneously. The idea was that the leading elements of the strike would drop torpedoes to force the enemy battle line to evade, and then once the enemy was in that evasion turn, the rest of the flights would swoop in and drop torpedoes to attack the enemy now that they couldn't really counter that attack, at least without turning back and then turning into the path of the original set of torpedoes. He also offers qualified support for the idea of a combined attack, specifically stating the principle of the combined attack by all available torpedo bomber flights is sound and should be aimed at whenever conditions allow this to be done. But the conditions would be rare, and an attempt to carry out such an attack might delay an otherwise successful surprise attack from one carrier, which would pin the enemy down more quickly. Factors which militate against this concentration are 1. The length of time required to range, fly off, form up, and approach with a large force operating from different ships. 2. The difficulties in communication between carriers in action. 3. The widely separated positions of carriers necessitated by operating their other aircraft in the approach stages of the action. And 4. The elimination of the factor of surprise. Although it is interesting to note that at this stage they're talking about a 35-minute form-up time, i.e. from the first aircraft leaving the deck to the formation moving out, as being a little slower than what they would ideally desire. Keep that in mind when you're looking at the form-up times of various other carrier formations and other naval exercises from other navies. He's not particularly a big fan of the V disposition of aircraft going into an attack, though, specifically noting that the V disposition of flights is not considered to be the best for attacking a moving target whose position is not accurately known beforehand because 1. The V disposition is unwieldy to maneuver, 2. The timing of the dive is difficult to judge, and 3. The widely spread disposition may afford a better target for gunfire and enable more guns to be brought to bear. That's enemy AA guns. The best disposition is thought to be flights astern stepped up because each flight can observe the movements of the next one ahead. The upper flights can use clouds as cover without danger of fouling another flight, and close observation can be made of the targets selected by the leading flight. So, hopefully see the pictures that have accompanied this section. He also notes that when air opposition is expected, i.e. when local air superiority has not been obtained by the attacker, an escort of one fighter flight to one torpedo bomber flight is considered necessary in order that the pilots of the torpedo bomber flights should be able to concentrate on their attack without interference. Failing this, there is always the danger of the leading flight being disorganized immediately prior to the dive, which would deprive the following flights of leadership, i.e. he's advocating for a 1-to-1 fighter to torpedo bomber ratio when you can't be assured of a lack of enemy air opposition. Admiral Dreher's response to these comments was actually also quite interesting. He noted in regards to mass torpedo bomber attacks that handling mass destroyer attacks and mass torpedo bomber attacks seem to have certain parallels in that it's very difficult to handle more than 3 destroyer flotillas going in for a massed attack at once, and potentially this is the case with torpedo bomber attacks. So he suggests that massed attacks from multiple aircraft carriers should only be undertaken when the time or the improved exercises between the carriers allow for it, but that forming up smaller massed attacks, i.e. combining multiple flights, either multiple flights from one carrier or multiple flights from different carriers in a 2 or 3 flight formation, would probably be a sweet spot that could be regularly undertaken. Also, and I'm picking edited highlights from a rather lengthy response, he notes that ideally, spotting aircraft for the battle fleet will be flown off from the ships themselves once all the heavy ships are fitted with catapults, which at this stage in the interwar period had not yet been done. He also concurs very much with the report from the commanding officer of HMS Furious, specifically noting that there needs to be a lot of work done on what is the best formation for torpedo bombers to adopt when attacking, and what order that formation should be in. But he also notes that, as well as providing fighter escort for the torpedo bomber aircraft, there's also the possibility that if such a fighter escort is provided more generally, then if they're not engaged with enemy combat air patrols, the fighters can assist the torpedo bombers by dropping light bombs and conducting machine gun attacks on the bridges and the exposed anti-aircraft positions of the ships that are under attack, which would then enhance the survivability of the torpedo bombers as they go in. There then follows a rather detailed breakdown of exactly how many torpedoes were dropped, by who, when, and what happened to them. So in total, all 5 flights launched torpedo attacks, and they launched torpedo attacks on various ships in the Red Fleet. So Hopefully there should be some kind of table appearing on screen, but for those of you who are just listening along, Flight 460 from Eagle recorded 2 misses, one torpedo that suffered a gyro failure after popping up on the surface, one torpedo that was dropped a bit high, resulting in the torpedo breaking up, and the remaining 2 torpedoes, as each flight is made up of 5 or 6 aircraft, 6 in this case, one scored a hit on Queen Elizabeth, and the other, although it attacked Queen Elizabeth, managed to miss so badly it actually scored a hit on HMS Marlborough, and there's actually even a question mark in brackets after that statement. Flight 461 from Furious was made up of 5 aircraft, and it actually had quite a lot of luck. It scored 3 hits on Queen Elizabeth and 2 further torpedoes that should have hit Queen Elizabeth but ran deep and went under it. Flight 462, also from Furious, again experienced a great deal of success, scoring 3 hits on HMS Nelson, 1 miss, and another miss, but this last torpedo for some reason was aimed at HMS Rodney, and it's noted that there was a fairly steep angle of entry. Flight 463 from Courageous scored 2 misses, 1 torpedo that broke up on hitting the water, and 3 torpedoes that hit HMS Queen Elizabeth, although one was dropped incredibly late, as there's a note that says, from the torpedo from Machine 63 dropped at a range of just 500 yards and at a speed of 72 knots, hit Queen Elizabeth 20 feet above the waterline. So basically just sailed along in a ballistic arc and smashed into the ship almost at the level of the main deck. I guess they're not getting that one back. Flight 464 from Courageous scored 2 hits on Marlborough, 2 misses, and 2 torpedoes that suffered gyro failures. One came up, broke the surface, and went haywire, and the other one was noted as being dropped somewhat high, which is probably what the gyro failure was a result of. It's noted that the torpedoes dropped from Mediterranean Fleet aircraft were actually performing significantly worse than those launched from Atlantic Fleet aircraft, as the Mediterranean Fleet drops included various torpedoes breaking up from being dropped too high, as well as gyroscopic failures, whereas misses from the latter, that is the Atlantic Fleet aircraft, were basically confined to a couple of deep runs, which was not something that they could really control. Although it is noted that some of the results are possibly due to the use of strengthened Mark 8 star torpedoes by the Atlantic Fleet aircraft, but it's also acknowledged that, well, the Atlantic Fleet pilots had obtained more practice in dropping torpedoes prior to the exercise. It's noted that the percentage of hits obtained, 43% when you exclude the torpedo that hit Queen Elizabeth so far above the waterline, was relatively good, but there was a considerable amount of concern that the approach taken was relatively hazardous, as the torpedo bombers came under extensive anti-aircraft fire from pretty much the entirety of the Red Fleet for at least 6 minutes before they made their drops, which were mostly undertaken at between 600 and 700 yards. So it was suggested that short-range drops may be a little bit hazardous, and that perhaps attacking at slightly longer range, but also perhaps attacking enemy ships that aren't the center column of the fleet, would be advisable in the future. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that the Red Fleet's commander also gets a say, so his response to the exercise is quite enlightening, because obviously he was at the receiving end of all these attacks, and he notes that, well, this was the first occasion where 3 aircraft carriers were operating together on the same side, and given the circumstances, the level of cooperation achieved is pretty good. He also accepts that, yes, delay is bound to occur when you concentrate torpedo bomber aircraft from various carriers for mass attack, but where you can accept that delay, he says specifically, there can be little doubt that concentrated attacks from all torpedo bomber aircraft should be more effective than separate attacks by the aircraft from each carrier. But he also notes that it's probably advisable that in the event of a concentrated torpedo bomber attack, they should concentrate on one column or one part of the battle line, as that would give more of a chance of completely disabling some of the enemy ships, and it would also mean that the torpedo bombers would be subject to less anti-aircraft fire, obviously only coming from a portion of the fleet being attacked. He also notes that if this concentrated attack takes the form of multiple flights dropping their torpedoes in quick succession, this could more severely strain the rate of supply of ships' anti-aircraft ammunition than everyone trying to drop a torpedo pretty much at exactly the same moment. At the time the attacks came in, the Red Battle Fleet was sailing in 3 columns, the port side column being Barham, Royal Sovereign, Ramillies and Resolution, the starboard column being Nelson, Rodney, Royal Oak and Revenge, and the centre column being Queen Elizabeth, the flagship, Marlborough, Benbow, and of course Benbow standing in for Emperor of India. And Red Fleet's commander notes that the attack was somewhat hampered due to the fact that it took place before the Red Battle Fleet was deployed, which meant that all the torpedo bombers had to fly over either the port or starboard column to get an attack in on Queen Elizabeth. He also notes that while Queen Elizabeth was hit quite severely, taking a total of 7 torpedo hits, this perhaps represented an over-concentration because one of the ideas of massed air attack was to hit multiple ships, and as it turned out, Marlborough and Nelson were hit, but Marlborough was hit perhaps more so by people breaking off an attack on Queen Elizabeth because it was too crowded than anything else. So perhaps spreading the attacks out would have been better. He also notes that from his perspective, if you have a superior or equal fleet, it might be better to withhold your surface action and accept the delay that results until you can summon a massed flight of torpedo bombers rather than trying to engage in a surface action as soon as possible, if that means your torpedo bomber strikes in support arrive in little bits and pieces. He also notes that as part of the aftermath of the exercise, it has been decided that the Atlantic Fleet would investigate combining 2 flights in torpedo bomber attacks, while the Mediterranean Fleet would go off and develop 3 flight attacks. So essentially they've agreed that yes, massing torpedo bombers beyond a single flight is a good idea, but each fleet is going to investigate at what level it's practical to do on a regular basis. He also notes that the use of torpedo sights, which were present on some of the attacking aircraft, didn't seem to make a huge amount of difference to the accuracy of the various torpedo bomber flights at short range, but that these systems might be more useful given that it has been suggested that the aircraft should drop their torpedoes sooner, i.e. a longer range attack, so that should be followed up. However, he also has a rather interesting set of observations when it comes to fighter cover, because of course this exercise was done using Blackburn darts, which are single-seater torpedo bombers. And he says that it seems probable the advent of 2-seater torpedo bombers, i.e. with one of them, the crew acting as a rear gunner, might modify the views of needing a heavy fighter escort, as a formation of 2-seater torpedo bombers would be a very hazardous one to attack, and therefore the presence of a protective fighter force may probably be unnecessary, thus surrendering fighters for other important duties, such as obtaining command of the air in the vicinity of our own battle fleet. Now, of course, war experience would prove that to be wrong, but essentially what he's saying is, well, if the torpedo bombers can protect themselves, at the very least, the level of fighter protection may be able to be reduced. But another interesting thing is, he says, a fighter with great endurance must of necessity be at a disadvantage to a fighter of lesser endurance. Hence, if future torpedo bomber flights can ensure their own protection, it should be possible to concentrate on the design of aircraft of small endurance but with the best all-round performance. So, that might have some bearing on Royal Navy fighter designs in the 1930s. Do you take a long-range recon fighter that can stick with the torpedo bombers for very long-distance strikes, or do you design a smaller, more capable single-seat fighter that can better establish air superiority? It's a question the Royal Navy would struggle with for the remainder of the interwar period. So I hope you've enjoyed that coverage of Exercise M1, and next time I come back to the 1929 Royal Navy Fleet exercises, we're going to be looking at Exercise OA, which took place 2 days later on the 25th of March 1929, shuffled the forces around, and was much more focused on the general exercise of a full fleet battle with multiple carriers on either side. So that will probably be a substantially longer video even than this one. So in any case, I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I hope you're looking forward to the next one and or any other videos that are coming out soon. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.